Uh, re ready whenever.
Two pieces of framing, some stupid shit Ale wanted me to say, which is that gradualist arguments about reforming factory farms exist on both sides. They obviously can say, we do it the slow way. And we can say, we should scope down factory farming or like not debeak chickens while we gradually increase adoption for this specific technology. Second thing is this is as animal rights activists, which means both sides have some degree of fiat, specifically that the movement itself buys into one strategy or the other. So it's not like you're some individual one animal rights activist. If it was, the debate has no margin. It's that the movement as a whole either pursues our strategy or your strategy. First argument is that sentience, which is the ability to experience pain or pleasure, is what determines the moral worth of beings. Classic Peter Singer stuff. Intuitively, we know and see this is true because we don't see a moral harm in eating plants, for instance. And we need to use pain because no other standard makes coherent sense. Humanity or like being a human as the standard is completely arbitrary. There has to be some element of humanity that we're like latching onto for it to have meaning. And we can't use like intelligence, for instance, because that excludes babies, people with disabilities, the elderly, etc. So we have to lean on things like pain, but that applies to most animals. Even if humans and animals don't have similar moral worth, we as creatures capable of higher level thought still ought afford them some degree of empathy, and we should still try and minimize their suffering. A, because we know that suffering is bad. B, because we as animal rights activists are uniquely likely to believe this stuff, which is why we're advocating for their rights. And C, because there's an inductive argument that says we are probably committing some kind of terrible moral harm right now. A, because we've been committing terrible moral harms throughout all of history that we weren't aware of, like people didn't know slavery was bad until they kind of figured it out. So even if I lack the words or the reasoning currently in this moment to explain why we should afford animals' rights, it's inductively likely that we're committing a moral harm, even if we can't explain it quite yet, because we have for all of history. Yeah, that we should try and minimize animal suffering. They'll say two things. Stripping them of sentience is a rights violation, and we can just get rid of factory farms. So, on the first question, four responses. A, the alternative is obviously that they're stripped of sentience via like horrific pain and death and being debeaked and factoried and stuff. So, the only delta, if they're going to lose their sentience and life either way, is whether there's more or less suffering involved. B, the technology certainly functions through GMOs and genomics. A, it's the part of animal development that gets the most funding every year because it influences things like the size of your livestock and every aspect of the produce of the market. So GMOs are the place getting the most investment and therefore the likeliest place for the technology to crop out of. B, it's the most efficient way to influence entire animal populations. If it's feasibly adoptable, which the motion kind of fiat, it probably has to be GMOs. And C is if we're going to influence the development of the central nervous system, like if we're going to create a way to lobotomize creatures, it probably has to be genetic in nature because different animals are different. And so there's no one way to lobotomize every kind of creature unless it starts in the genome. If that's true, we're not taking away their sentience. They never had sentience to begin with. If it's a rights violation, it's a rights violation unto a fetus, which we don't believe in because, hopefully we're all pro-choice. C is that having and not having sentience are equally consent violative. We know that pain is bad and that we should try and minimize suffering because every creature on Earth instinctively pushes away from pain and it is, definitionally something terrible. But we don't know, morally or otherwise, whether sentience is inherently good or bad. Creatures don't have the opportunity to choose or not choose sentience. So taking away something that we don't know has moral value is not necessarily a bad thing, but minimizing suffering is necessarily a good thing. The fourth thing is that humanity needs to consume. If their perfect world happens and there are no more factory farms, the best case is we just all eat plants. But those plants are identical to animals without sentience because they're living things that can't experience pain. So no matter what, you're creating more unsentient beings on either side of the house, even in their best case. Second question, and just like the offensive of the round, is why are we more able to do our thing than they are to abolish factory farms? Crazy enough, trying to destroy a multi-billion-dollar industry is like beyond the capacity of the animal rights peoples. Lots of human beings, they just really like meat. Take it from me. I love that shit. B, the fucking big meat has existed. It's one of the oldest fucking entrenched special interests in the history of the world because human beings have always needed to consume, which is why big dairy spends like gajillions of dollars every single year. And big meat will fight you and probably win because they have more lobbying committed to more politicians over longer windows, better institutional relationships, and because like most of the politicians eat meat. See, there's just constantly increasing global carrying capacity. The population grows by about 3 people every second. Those people need to consume more, and factory farming is hugely calorie efficient. B, we lack the land to grow food in totally vegan capacity. It is the case that like plants can be eaten and stuff, but it takes a lot of land to grow lots of plants, and we need the caloric density afforded by like chicken farms in order to make sure that people are fed. E is the biomodification of plants to get like soybeans that have 4 extra grams of protein or just enough GMOs in order for the plant-based diet to be actually healthy and livable for people is cost prohibitive for like 95% of the world, which is why veganism is on net more expensive. And F is as you push to get rid of factory farms, people have this vent valve where they, instead of factory farming, just choose to raise meat in like a fucking grass-fed open range kind of way, which obviously doesn't solve the problem because you're still butchering animals. So even if you pursue your goal, it's not likely you achieve the beneficial outcomes that we do, which means we're just net better. Why is ours more possible? It's non-adversarial. You and Big Meat are on the same side on our side of the house because you offer them a means of, continuing to kill animals without having to spend those billions and billions of dollars on lobbying, and they just have to add one more GMO to a cocktail of 60 million. So the only people who have any reason to oppose our advocacy are like the fucking oat milk producers, but those people have to be nominally anti-animal suffering because it's the basis of their brand. And so actually everybody in the world is on the same side working together to lobotomize all the pigs. Um, B, it's just not that hard to convince people of this like lobotomization thingy. I mean, it kind of begs the question because, maybe I already convinced you of the lobotomization thingy, but, I guess we'll find out. C is that either people are already okay with factory farming, like most people in the SQUO, and therefore could not care less about animal rights violations and therefore would not care about lobotomization, or they do care about animal rights and are therefore animal activists, which means they're covered by fiat. Got 'em, bada bing, bada boom. And even if we don't get fiat, the vegan movement is like very humongously woke. Um, so like genomic lobotomization, if it was a rights violation at all, would be a rights violation unto the fetus. But because most of these people are woke, they don't think fetuses have rights. And also they probably read Peter Singer, which is why they eat like bivalves. Proud to propose.
Here, here. Hello.
Okay, this is off on. All right, time. We'll go ahead and start now. First off-case position is what Roy predicted. It's a principle violation against animals. Animals can't consent. The only way we can access utility is through individual preferences. We can only know preferences via people's expressions. I may say something that Daniel hates, and the only way I know this is via asking. Now, Gov will say that we can know from animals' reaction to pain. This means they can't consent to that. This might be true, but we don't have access to comparative, i.e., we can't ask them if they would stop meaningfully existing. This is what Roy tells you. Why then do we care? This is supercharged by the fact that even a human can make informed consent into what their non-intelligence looks like. Okay, so why then can't we intervene if we think we're doing something good? First and importantly is the action-inaction distinction. It's worse to kill someone than it is to fail to save their life. This means in instances of uncertainty, we should default to inaction. I think this is especially true for a fundamentally pacifist organization like vegans. If we buy any of Roy's argumentation that they're all progressives, I think they are probably also like anti-doing active harm. Second, though, our best guess is probably that the average animal would like to be alive. Animals have an evolutionary drive to continue to stay alive, and even in instances of pain, because it allows them to reproduce. Now, they're going to say that this is that you would like prefer if they don't die. Note one, this is downstream of the Prague offense. But secondly, it doesn't actually hit the question that we are raising, which is what does it mean to be meaningfully alive? If we know that animals have a revealed preference to avoid pain and stay alive, we don't know whether it is the literal existence of being pain or in painless, or whether it is the fact of having conscience in the first place that they value. As per Roy's warranting about why we can never know this, we should exercise epistemic humility and not try to do an active harm. Second off-case position is it impacts deciding who deserves to live. Rather than arguing animals inherently deserve life, respect as human beings, as off is, Gov ties their deservedness to life to their cognitive capacity. This makes it easier to abuse animals in other ways. Think about it this way. Even if the animals' rights advocates have one threshold for like how much conscience justifies being killed. Others won't. But by strengthening the narrative that the willingness to deserve life is based on your intelligence, by lowering the intelligence and then saying go ahead and kill them, this means that that narrative becomes more prevalent for people who have other thresholds of what is the intelligence line. This means that it leads people to do things like abandon pets because they're not as important, or harm cows, etc. This also has downstream impacts on people. What then are the implications? Roy talks a lot about fetuses, but what about people who are having like severe dementia? Do they suddenly just like lose their life to right because they are no longer cognitively able? What about people who are born with developmental disabilities? I think there are very harmful downstream implications of deciding that life is only valued if you have conscience. Third off-case position is harms to animals. Think about what abolition versus the technological implementation is likely to look like. One of them is a political change that affects all farms, whereas the other is a business decision. On their side, they probably do some sort of media push to factory farms and to consumers saying you must eat ethical meat, otherwise this is bad, similar to like organic and non-GMO labels in SQO. While it comes to mind, quick response to that GMO thing, because if it is existing through GMOs, then it runs up against other issues that the vegan institution already has, i.e. these people already think eating GMO farmed and things is bad, so you probably have institutional fracturing within the advocacy network, which means your push is less effective. Okay, back to what I was actually saying. On our side, they probably lobby Congress, write legislation, etc. I'll implicate this later. Switching to the new technology is likely to be expensive, meaning that only very wealthy factory farms will adopt it and make their products more expensive as a result. Think about like Whole Foods Market that already has a bunch of organic produce. They probably are going to be the first to adopt this. The result is that only some people are going to get access to ethical meat because there are some people who do not believe it is, some businesses that don't believe it's a worthwhile trade-off to invest in the expensive technology, and therefore many farms still won't use it. Additionally to the fact, this means that there are still some animals who get harmed, and in fact comparatively more on their side of the house, because on their side, they strengthen the meat industry because now that a bunch of people who haven't been eating meat right now because they feel it's unethical suddenly are like, oh, maybe it's fine if I do. This means that they go out and demand for beef, for example, increases, and people who do not live in areas where the affordable meat or like the ethical meat is will just eat the unethical meat, which means more animals are actually being harmed. But there's also a harm on humans here because additionally to the fact that animals are still being harmed, they're now individuals who are morally attacked by animal rights advocates. I don't think I needed to prove to anyone why animal rights advocates are often like very extreme. They're culturally insensitive of cultures that eat dogs. They are like virulently vegan pro in a way that shames all meat eaters sometimes, or at least there's a small subset that is. This means that there is going to create a stigma about eating the non-ethical meat that harms the least well-off, which is how we should weigh on it with regards to humans. These are people who live in food deserts who cannot afford the ethical meat, and the businesses that prioritize them are never going to bother to invest in this technology because they know they have a captive market in the food desert and won't bother. This means, compare this to the stigma around fast food. Wealthy liberals describe it as morally wrong to eat fast food without recognizing many people don't have another option. Last off-case position is externalities. By supporting the use of this technology, the animal rights movement effectively rubber stamps the existence of the factory farm industry at all. Even if they make a clear distinction, the increased demand for beef among wealthy ethical consumers trickles down to more demand for beef elsewhere in a non-ethical way. This entrenches the institution of factory farming in society, which is incredibly problematic because the industry has many negative externalities beyond the harm to animals. This is most obvious in like food waste, climate change, extensive water use, the obesity epidemic, land destruction, soil erosion, etc. I think we all know why factory farms are pretty bad. The counterfactual then is government change. Now, Gov says that policy is never going to change because of incentives. Few issues with this. One, there is political will. They talk a lot about why vegans are a strong, like very powerful, unified demographic. I think this is especially true. Recognize that we have a comparatively higher chance of creating policy change in our side of the house because we remain unified, whereas on their side, it is almost certainly the case that some people disagree. Yes, I agree with Roy that Fiat says you have a large amount of the community, but you don't have the entire community, especially because some people care about GMOs and whatnot. But second, economic incentives are changing with the rise of artificial meat. The technology is improving rapidly, which means pretty soon there will no longer be economic incentives for these businesses to continue to use factory farmed meat, which means that it's very important we have the policy framework in place now, i.e. we start drafting the legislation right now. So as soon as those incentives change, we can switch over immediately. Okay, on case. The framing on sentience determines the moral worth of being. I think the LOC just basically beats this. If we buy Roy's line that people have sentience, then we do an act, that animals have sentience, and we do an act of harm against them by violating that. Animals are likely to know what is better for themselves. We default to the preferences of the actor because they are the only ones who are experts in their own existence, which is arrogant for us to believe that we as humans know better than them. Secondly is the action and action distinction, which is supercharged by you being the vegan movement. You prefer to do no harm because you are likely to be pacifist, as opposed to hypothetically cause less harm farther down the stream by doing something harmful. Let's talk about that slavery example for a minute, because I really don't think Roy thought it through. The Gov advocacy on the slavery position would be make it so slaves don't have sentience and don't feel pains and then continue slavery. I don't think I need to explain why this makes no sense. It is preferable to abolish the harmful institution with the understanding that our moral standards might change, so we stop doing harm downstream. And if we had instead done something like lower the sentience of enslaved people, that would have entrenched the institution. Now, Roe tries to preempt, recognize it is downstream of them winning the Prague impact. It doesn't actually beat back the action-in-action principle distinction we say. Okay, onto this argument that people need to consume and factory farms will never go away. This is just not true. Artificial meat is rising. And they talk about how we have a lack of capacity to do this. The issue is there's a fundamental trade-off. They might say artificial meat is going to happen in both worlds, but recognize that there is a trade-off here, not in the advocacy's position, but in scientific funding. There is limited economic incentive in SQO for people to do investing in science that is going to allow this. Recognize then that really there is a trade-off between pursuing the technology that makes animals not feel pain and the technology that allows for artificial meat. This means in their world, they're slowing down the rise of artificial meat, which is the only way to abolish in the first place. I talk about how people raise meat themselves. This is like preferable because if you are a small scale institution, you do less pain to the animals. So this is strictly preferable. And then being buddy with big meat is bad because of the externality argument. Proud to oppose.
Here. MG.
Okay, is everyone good? It's going to be some overviews, then I'll follow the LOC roughly. First overview, acting to abolish factory farms is independently terrible for your movement regardless of the counterfactual. 4 reasons why. A, politicians don't consider you a credible movement and don't negotiate with you. Politicians have to have demands that are relatively realistic made onto them by movements. Otherwise, they don't even let movements into the room to negotiate with them. If the demand you are making is something that is so wildly outside the Overton window that literally no single political party in America actually believes it, then no politician ever has any incentive to listen to you and they believe that you are an uncredible movement. B, right-wing demonization is far more effective in their world than in our world. In our world, we can still advocate for certain kinds of reforms around factory farming that are intuitively bad to most people, but we still respect the fact that the vast majority of Americans love hamburgers. On their side of the house, literally even the Green New Deal got demonized for supposedly banning hamburgers. They're actually trying to ban hamburgers. This is causing a massive backlash against all kinds of animal rights activists and get these movements drowned out by other kinds of capital. C is that unfulfilled goals will result in movement fatigue. As I articulated at the top of the PMC, both sides get to do some level of reform and gradualism and get to do some level of benefits, but their side has a uniquely such a big goal that is so hard to attain, and people will burn out. Even if they are correct that eventually someday you could get super epic alternative meat that solves the whole problem, a ton of activists are going to leave in the meanwhile because they don't actually see any progress potentially being made, which decreases the movement capital to do all manner of other things. D, big ag will actually just spend a ton of money to fifth column you. It might be true that you have a ton of vegans, for example, if they're super coordinated, but they stop being super coordinated when big ag buys a ton of them off to start advocating the opposite thing of what you already want, which causes far more movement dissent. Note that movement unity is conditional on the fact that big agriculture doesn't actually spend on trying to actively destroy your movements. Impacts of this. 1, it uplayers the entirety of the principle. A, the principle makes no sense. They're like, you should be pacifist and not intervene, and then are like, you should intervene against slavery. Obviously, we are advocating for intervention. We are saying that they're structurally unable to intervene if the movement gets worse, which means they get severed from any part of the principle that talks about how they are able to solve the harm that is happening to animals that get killed. B, it beats the funding and alternative meat arguments. Why is that true? Because if you have a far weaker animal rights movements, the demand to actually create alternative meat and the extent to which it gets politically promoted is much weaker. They say, the technology is happening right now. Doesn't matter. Big meat will do things like 1, buy up politicians to be able to ban the use that is happening in Florida right now, or 2, just shut down the funding implementation in the first place, or 3, make it so that big meat can undercut the prices or do cartelize, for example, since it is structurally impossible for this kind of alternatives to ever outprice big meat. The end point of this is that the path dependency to be able to get alternative meat or other forms that are always good, as the LOC says, is to have a credibly engaged political movement that can actually get some politicians on side. Secondary review. Why is distracts from other advocacy. One, there are still many other intuitive reasons, as the LOC literally lists, as to why general huge factory farms are probably not the best of ideas. For example, that they can be very environmentally harmful, that killings are intuitively bad. We can still message those on our side of the house, and there is no contradiction. We are not saying it's fine that we murder tons of animals. We are saying we're taking an intelligent harm minimization thing right now, and then we will work to do the rest of things. And it makes you seem like a more credible movement and allows you to persuade things like moderates who maybe don't believe in banning everything, but do believe that certain intuitive parts of the movement should be reformed. Secondly, this is far better for technological innovation. Their argument is, there's a limited pool of funding. Yeah, there's a limited pool of funding because no actual funding has gone anywhere right now. The reason why is because it's all gotten shut down by big meat or otherwise has not been able to make a significant dent in food prices. Like, guys, the Impossible Whopper has not gone all that well. So what happens? We said an actual precedent this kind of technology can work, which is super, super, super good because the pool of funding itself expands. There are former people who are willing to enter the space of reforming animal rights or doing things that are better for animal well-being because it is clear that smart implementations of them can actually make a significant change in the world. I mean, so we far amplify all the other alternatives you could possibly get. Let's deal with the principal argument. First thing, if we win that it's GMOs, they lose the principle for reasons articulated in PMC. What is their response to GMOs? They're like, some vegans don't like GMOs. Like, yeah, like the super crunchy ones don't. I don't know why this matters. One, they've conceded that structurally it's impossible for it to not be a GMO technology. Two, GMOs are super established in American well-being. Like, I think like probably 3 or 4% of people don't like GMOs. That seems fine. Doesn't have it seem like a strong enough lobby group. 3, okay, the vegans are pissed off. Why does this mean that we can't use GMOs to stop factory farming? I'm not really sure why this is even a response. They've conceded all the structural reasons what is GMOs, and if it is GMOs, there is no violation of their sentience because they were not born either they were not even born either sentient or non-sentient. The consent violation does not exist because you do not even consent to being born in the first place. Let's respond to their arguments. They say, we know that their preference for being alive because they are alive. Animals have no choice as to whether they were alive or not. They were forced into aliveness. If anything, the argument that we should rectify that consent violation by allowing them to exit that fact. I think it is far more intuitive that pain is bad than it is that being alive is good or bad. Because being alive comports a ton of bad things that come with it, along with some good things. Whereas being painful is unambiguously bad. So in the world of moral uncertainty, it is far less uncertain as a preference that causing pain is bad than that living is bad. And given that both of these are general consent violations, our side is strictly better on this question. Secondly, they just say there's an action and action distinction. Like, I don't know why. Like, if a starving child in the pond right next to me and I'm just sitting around and walking around and I see them and I don't intervene, as is happening right now with millions, if not billions of animals being tortured every single year, and I don't save them, that is so neglectful as to be the cause of a death. I am not sure why this is any meaningfully different other than the just assertion that there is some kind of meaningful distinction. Thirdly, activist movements should have a prior to start being active, i.e. to do kinds of things, even if they are not certain about the principles all around. Their slavery example votes for us. Okay, like, the example was sort of poorly chosen from Roy, but I actually don't think this matters. The broader point we are making is that intervening in a situation where there is mass harm being committed in a way that we know we can immediately intervene is obviously ipso facto good, even if we have some general moral uncertainty. Because one, the uncertainty was already caused by the animals. They didn't choose to be sentient, so there is no consent violation, or if it is, it already happened. 2, we can't know their preferences, but we can understand that the preference of pain is probably a stronger preference than the preference to be alive, which is far harder to approximate. Thirdly, we don't know anyone's preferences ever. People can say their preference, but we actually don't know if they're lying, for example. People might not even know their own preferences, which justifies infinite movement and action because we can never intervene on behalf of slaves if we don't think that it's actually bad for them to be enslaved, for example, which is the actual advocacy on this question. End point of this is that movements obviously have to intervene. There is no consent violation. If there was, it was already done. And the GMOs argument all up layers it. I think the principle is pretty dead in this debate. They say that you're going to mistreat animals for other reasons because, like, they think that intelligence is the only thing that matters. 1, no, obviously, the message is being important because animals are feeling massive amounts of pain and we should reduce that. 2, this obviously is not going to be, if we win that it's GMOs, obviously it doesn't get perceived this way, just perceived with slight modifications to minimize the amount of pain that other animals can feel, not the broader worth of animals and feeling pain. Thirdly, if the animal rights movement gets more powerful with a certain, as the overviews imply, they certainly can do more advocacy on this front. And we may flip this argument. Fourthly, we can still advocate for all of these good things they talk about on our side, and we have more political capital to do so. Anyway, fifthly, there is no link here beyond just like it like spills over, I guess. Why? I don't know. Like, if I see an animal not get tortured, we're like, I can hit my dog now. Like, I do not understand this argument at all. They say vegans don't like GMOs. I already beat this. They say only the big farms adopt it. One, the big farms dominate the market. Why is that true? A, the factory farming movement rewards huge extents of scale because you need to be able to produce a ton to be able to undercut prices. And B, they've also cartelized and monopolized the market. The end point is that the vast majority of meat is being made by the big ones who would actually benefit from this kind of thing. So even if some holdouts exist, probably very small. Secondly, it's far more affordable to use this kind of practice than to have to fight the lawsuits, etc., that will happen absent that. So it's still economically efficient for literally any farm. And thirdly, they'll probably just pass it into laws. If it's so popular and so good for big meat too, big meat will want to isolate smaller competitors and will pass laws saying you have to use the technology in order to create meat, which seems like it's probably a good thing. They say you get morally attacked by animal rights advocates. Obviously worse on their side if animal rights advocates are generally bad and factory farms are still torture sites. They're going to just attack literally everyone. And if they are super unstrategic, this means that they isolate far more people, which is a farther link into our overview. On our case, they say some people will disagree with veganism or GMOs. Doesn't matter. I already beat the alternatives question. A lot of these get shut down in the status quo. The only way to get them is on our side. Also, alternatives don't solve for the vast majority of food production in the world, as the PMC says, and they conceded. Very proud to propose.
Cool. Here. I'm out.
It's going to be the MG overviews and then two new overviews. Those overviews are going to be on the externalities argument in the LOC and then the principle. All of this stuff about how acting to abolish is bad is nonsensical in a world where we do it the right way. Unrealistic demands, no, we won't make them. We'll make gradual demands. The right-wing demonization is going to happen on both sides of the house. Fox is always going to cherry-pick the worst people to prove their points about how they're trying to ban burgers. They literally make this argument themselves when they say the Green New Deal was painted the same way. No difference whether or not it's actually true because Fox News is always going to cherry-pick someone who says it's true. They say movement fatigue. We say small improvements are going to be able to pay it off. People feel moments of success in instances where they get even small wins, especially given though they're sort of celebrated within the movement. Next, this argument about Big Ag, but I hate to break to you, Big Ag is going to be commenting the animal rights movement on both sides of the house. The only delta they have access here is the difference in the degree of funding which they're putting forth, but I think this is kind of nonsensical where in both worlds people are sort of working actively against them. Specifically when they make this next argument how Big Meat is going to ban tech, we can concede that Big Meat wants to ban this tech. The implications of this argument are twofold. First, it proves that this technology is inherently incredibly expensive given Big Meat doesn't want it to take over the things that they don't want to transition to it. This beats a bunch of their arguments everywhere in the round because it proves that you also need significant political will in order to overcome this. Specifically, I'll also answer this stuff about how GMO is cheap. They just have to add it to a cocktail. A couple of reasons why this technology is incredibly unlikely to be GMO. First, just case statement caveats out of it. It says that case statement says that the intelligence of the animals have to be reduced to not feel pain. The implication of this argument is that they had one, sufficient intelligence, and two, the capacity to feel pain prior to being introduced to this technology because the word reduce has to reduce from something to nothing in order for it to get reduced to zero. The implication of this argument is straightforward. The technology has to be applied after these animals are sufficiently intelligent and able to feel pain, which totally decks this argument in the first place. Second, the stuff about how Big Meat wants to ban the tech is also sufficient to be the second overview about how the funding is going to lead to other tech, because Big Meat is just going to attempt to defund it in the first place. On to the overviews. The first overview is on external harms. Note that the op advocacy is only able to stop the harms that occur to animals, but isn't able to comment the broader harms, which means if we win any risk that our processes are able to gradually make any deltas or shut down specific factory farms, then we're able to make progress in this round. The first impact is on climate change. First, observe that animals produce a lot of pollution. Notably, this is something like 10 to 20% of total pollution produced by the US, but this is incredibly marginal at specific tipping points, because even if they're winning that some climate change is going to happen on both sides, one, it happens faster on their side, which causes more animals to die in the short term, i.e. one more storm just has the potential to destroy habitats, kill millions of animals that within a specific area, which is substantially larger than any impact that factory farming has in the round. Second, climate change impacts are irreversible because once we cross tipping points that increase the number of things like wildfires that releases more CO2 into the atmosphere, which creates an impact. Third, even if you don't buy any of that, there's just a time frame impact. The impacts happening sooner is worse because people die sooner. The second impact is a new impact about nitrogen runoff. Factory farms have an incentive to overuse fertilizer, which contains large amounts of nitrogen. And second, animals poop out large amounts of nitrogen from eating those fertilized crops. The implication of this argument that creates dead spots in nearby water sources due to high nitrogen contact, where there isn't enough oxygen for algae and other animals to live. The implication is that animals that exist within these dead spots are unable to exist within ecosystems. Ecosystems collapse, etc. Fish within the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of this runoff shows up, just die in the millions. This is also irreversible because there's no way to put oxygen back into the water after it's been replaced with nitrogen. The third impact is on food drain. Feeding animals is just inefficient compared to factory meat or plants. Food shortages are coming now because climate change is around to reach tipping points where crops start failing. Nitrogen in soil, etc. are all reasons why So being able to have efficient sources of food is uniquely key right now. Notably, the impact of all of these is linear. If we're able to kick the bucket on climate change by a couple years, one, it gives us time to create adaptive solutions to these problems rather than coming up with them earlier. And second, all the time frame stuff I did above. Second overview is on the principle. Our argument is straightforward. Animals are conscious per case background that we are reducing their intelligence. Our principle is about a violation against an existing entity with an existence entity with preferences. Notably, I can get out of this fetus argument in a couple of ways. First, cross-apply the analysis about how these things aren't GMOs, i.e. they're likely to happen after they are no longer fetus. Second, I can just bite the bullet. Violations against fetuses matter, but the reason why I still think abortions are good because there's a bigger violation against the mother, i.e. they don't really give a warrant for why these people can't have preferences, especially in as much as everybody agrees in this round that animals have some degree of preferences. Next, the stuff about how it's going to be GMOs. There's a double bind here. Either it is GMOs, in which case it's a slam dunk. They can see that vegans hate GMOs. You're the animal rights movement, which at an actor analysis level immediately closes the door on any winning PMR because the vegan movement actively hates GMOs, so they're never going to advocate for them. Second, the MG tells us that life is inherently coercive. One, the logical implication of this argument is that we should be automatically killing everyone, which is obviously an unsensical and inane conclusion. But second, the easier way out is even if they're right that these animals being born in the first place was coercive, that doesn't justify a second consent violation where we force them to take a second decision to goes against their preferences. Third, the MG tells us that pain is going to be the only unambiguous source of knowledge in the round. First, note that pain is not ambiguous. It's cold conceded out of the LLC that the only way that we're able to evaluate pain is through people's preferences, which means their pain pleasure framework doesn't even make sense in a world where things aren't conscious. Lack of consciousness isn't necessarily even preferable to a world in which you are experiencing pain because it operates on an entirely different scale. You can't have a preference for not having a preference because you don't exist to not have a preference in the first place. You as a moral actor stop existing as soon as you no longer have preferences because of the conceded analysis. This means that being alive is a prerequisite to any pain or pleasure analysis that the MG and PMR are going to try to go for. Implication of this argument is pretty simple in the round. It means that just defaulting to, whoa, we're certain they're in pain is not sensible because as soon as we cut them off from that pain, they no longer exist as a moral agent. But second, it means that the only way we can evaluate which thing is better or worse is through asking about their preferences. Notably, second conceded argument out of the LOC is that the only way, or that even if they're right about everything, that we're able to communicate with them through pain or that we're certain about pain, the thing that we can't understand is how they would feel about not being conscious. It's conceded that even a human could not know how they would evaluate being conscious versus not being conscious, which means that there's no way that an animal could do that, and two, there's no way an animal could communicate that information to us. The implication of this argument is that we have a fundamental uncertainty about whether the action that we are enacting onto another is going to be good or bad. The analogy is straightforward. If I could flip a coin and either double your utility or take away all of your utility, that would be a bad thing for me to do without first asking you, why does the action-inaction distinction exist? First, we think that it should exist because otherwise it creates impossible moral barriers for anybody to act moral. I.e., if I have an obligation to stop every murder that's happening everywhere in the world, or try my best to do so, it's one, impossible to do so. Two, the implementation of this gets bogged down with actual details of implementation. I.e., the process of researching every harm such that it can behave optimally actively cuts back against this sort of intuition. But third, I think this is just in line with our moral intuitions. They don't give an argument for why it shouldn't exist, other than it's bad to not save a drowning kid or a starving kid. But the implication, or the flip to this, is that imagine you are the person who actively caused that kid to drown and then didn't save them. This is especially worse because one, you caused it, but two, the fact that you didn't save them after the fact means that our impact necessarily turns theirs. Third, I'm sorry. Lastly, how does this interact with the round? First, it outweighs every other impact in the round because principles outweigh at a long-termism level. I.e., when we have principles, they're able to operate in the long term, create moral frameworks for a society that have downstream impacts down the round. Second is least well-off weighing. We think that animals are going to be the least well-off actor in the round because they don't have access to things like rights and the ability to vote, etc., and are experiencing constant pain. Third, principle is how we evaluate all their pragmatic harms. Notably, our premise in this round is pragmatic. We say that we should maximize the preferences of individuals, which means at worst, this operates in clash with every other prag argument in the round, but at best, we come from a moral foundational framework, which means we uplayer literally everyone else because they're only ones answering the question, how do we evaluate what is good for these animals? Fourth, we think that utilitarianism is always going to be biased and it's co-opted by people in power. You can cross-play all this slavery analogy that's been going on here. The reason why slavery was justified is because people said it was utilitarianly good and good for the economy. Notably, this is supercharged here because animals have no political power or ability to adapt to that. Fifth, their PMC induction analysis flows away. Util is always going to be built by these peoples in power. Sixth, this frames out all of their arguments. If we win that animals would rather be alive and suffering or are likely to believe this, then to die, this functions as independent offense. Notably, this is winning even if we conceded bold overviews and everything else in the round about how our advocacy is literally useless and can't do anything because theirs is actively harmful and commits principled obligations against them. Proud to oppose.
Here.
LOR.
A few things on new calls. I'm fine with new applications as long as they don't allow and don't require a new warrant. Not new unless it's not called. I don't care if you call a lot of POOs as long as they're like not just to like disrupt them.
All right, everyone good? All right. I'm going to go for something different than Daniel went for, and we're going to talk about the entrenchment of factory farms as a sole ballot. There are a few levels to this argument. There are two links we give you. Ale responds to the policy one, but completely misses the other one, which is about economic demand. The argument that Ale drops out of PMC is that as soon as meat is perceived to be ethical again, people who have not been buying it because they do not believe it to be correct are going to buy much more of it. This in turn increases demand for meat, which is mostly provided by these big factory farms, which in turn harms the ability to change any policy because, as Roy artfully tells you in PMC, people just like eating meat. Therefore, the factory farms are going to become more entrenched. Now let's talk about the other argument that Ale did respond to, but didn't recognize the nuance of the policy argument. What we tell you is that economic incentives are changing with the development of artificial meat. This means that policy incentives are also changing, but they only change if people do not like factory farms for another reason, i.e. if people end up liking meat, even if artificial meat becomes available, the factory farms are now larger, have more money and more ability to lobby, as they tell you happens. But additionally, they don't understand how policy is actually function. There is a critical time trade-off, as Daniel tells you. We can buy that artificial meat happens on either side of the house, but the question is when the artificial meat happens and when the policy happens. What we tell you is that there are two time trade-off levels. The first is in the development of policy. Policy takes time to develop. On our side of the house, we are actively spending time writing that policy now, which means as soon as there is political will, we can pass it immediately. But secondly, there's a time trade-off in science. Ale tries to tell you that scientific funding is going to increase, the pie is going to get larger, but recognize this takes time. Ale himself tells you that this only happens once the meat is popular, which, as we give you many warrants throughout, is going to at least take some time because this is a conscientious media push from the vegan advocacy movement. But now let's talk about their other line of defense here, which is other actors. Daniel talks about it, but I'll reiterate. Even if other organizations are working to stop things like climate change, there is still a delta from the vegan rights people, but also there's a double bind here in their entire advocacy. Throughout the round, we seem to be very confused about whether these people are like moderates who can work with the factory farms, be all buddy-buddy, or whether they are like crazy vegans who refuse to compromise. I think the line Daniel tells you is really pretty clean here, which is the more morally pure you are, the more likely you are to be a good advocate, which means there's a double bind. Either the vegans are likely to care about these more moderate positions and can do their efficacy, or they are ideologically pure, in which case, as soon as they use GMOs, they turn against them because it has been conceded that GMOs are something that many people don't like. Okay, now let's weigh on this ballot. I can outweigh on 4 levels against their principle, even if they're winning. First is actor analysis. Your highest order priority as the animal rights movement is protecting the most animals. Seeing as climate change happens via natural disaster and via extinction, this means that the fastest abolition of factory farms is the best. This means that even if the only delta on the round is it takes 2 more years to develop artificial meat and get factory farms out of existence, this means that is 2 more years in which massive emissions have continued. Given that we are already so close to the brink of climate change and natural disasters are already happening, as Daniel tells you, this time trade-off is damning. Animals are harmed by 1, massive global level extinction events, and 2, small-scale wildfires. Second is harms to humans. If we buy the gov warranting that sentience determines deservedness to life, and the animal rights movement believes this, then we are obligated to value humans above animals as they have a higher level of sentience. The only risk of harm to humans in this entire round is via climate change. Therefore, you should weigh that most highly. The closest gov gets to an argument impacting humans is like, humans deserve to eat meat. Cool, then get artificial meat here faster. They haven't weighed this against the actual loss to life of climate change. I think this is pretty straightforward. Third is weighing on probability. This one is rather straightforward. Given that we have epistemic humility, as Roy tells you, about what it even means to be conscious, to be alive, we cannot be certain of the impact of any of the arguments about taking away consciousness or restoring it. What we can be certain of is humans and animals are harmed by dying. Therefore, we should weigh on the certain probability of climate change. Climate change is happening in SWO, therefore we have 100% certainty that it will continue to happen, whereas all the principled arguments are in the realm are very nebulous and we don't know how to weigh them. Finally, respecting the rights of humans. Humans have a stronger preference not to die, so if you buy any of the principled arguments about how we need to respect animal life, they apply stronger to humans and we need to prioritize them higher. Proud to oppose.
Here, PMR. I don't care if you generate offense from MO responses as long as the MO argument is new.
All right, gang. Ale thinks he's going to sneak a rank off me this tournament because I'm being monotone, so get ready for enthusiasm. Oh, man. Here we go. Oh, my God. First ballot is that they do fuck nothing, and we're the only risk of offense on the principle. Why? Well, they've conceded that the fucking factory farmers have entrenched relationships with politicians and hundreds of billions of dollars that you don't have, and that their power is so significant that they have banned artificial meat in Florida to prevent competition, straight out of the MG, and are destroying your ability to engage with them in basically every arena. And that even if you did create some kind of substitute for their meat and so forth and so on, they would just use cartel power to reduce the prices of their meat to price 95% of the world who's cost sensitive more so than caring about fucking.
Sorry, point of order. The specific cartel power argument is different. I hear the lobbying. Cartel is different from lobbying.
Yeah, it was.
There's also an MG.
Both of them were in the MG. I agree, they are different. They had 2 warrants. That's right. I got hella.
Pranav, do you need it?
I have it. You're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, cool. I just missed it.
Yeah, they've conceded like 95% of the world is price sensitive and doesn't give a shit about abstract philosophy, so they'll go for the cheap meat until the other alternatives get blown out of the market. For just like a billion reasons, none of their advocacy works, all conceded out of MG. The responses we get are A, we will be strategic and gradual. Yeah, you tried that in the status quo and then they banned artificial meat. Obviously, it's not working. B, sneaking up like the Pink Panther on the biggest meat lobby in existence and being gradual doesn't mean they don't see you coming. We've proven that in the status quo, they already see you coming and are already bludgeoning you to death. The second response is they'll fight you too because like it's expensive to lobotomize animals. A, no warrant at all. Daniel just says Ale said this. He said artificial meat was expensive. Just absolutely no explanation as to why one more GMO is particularly expensive. They've conceded that our animals already have dozens upon dozens of GMOs in them and the technology already exists per background. So there's no upfront costs. And B is they've conceded that it's cheaper than lawsuits. Like adding a GMO certainly costs less than $1 billion a year from big dairy to fight big oats. So obviously then we have a chance of reducing suffering. Why does this matter? Because the principle is that it's wrong to take away creatures' sentience. But the PMC told you that there are 2 things that take away sentience. Lobotomies and death. And this is agreed with in the LOR when Sarah says for about 3 minutes that like nobody wants to die and death is bad and we know that death is bad. So if they're going to die anyways and lose their sentience and violate the principle because they're being fucking factory farmed, the only delta in the round at all is whether we reduce the suffering they experience. And the best, absolute best case of their arguments are like, we don't necessarily know if suffering is worse or better than sentience, but we've all agreed that it has some moral worth to prevent pain because every creature on Earth instinctually tries to avoid that pain. And because we as animal rights activists obviously believe that animals being tortured is bad, which is the pre-rational intuitionist argument I gave from the PMC, which means if they're going to lose sentience either way, the principle is always violated. There's a separate principle about reducing their suffering that only we access with only a risk of offense. Second ballot is the precedent argument that Ale makes in the MG, which is that if we show that a technology can work for the purposes of the animal rights movement, if a technology can make some kind of improvement overall, we get much more buy-in from everyday people and much more willingness to support other technologies like artificial meat or, like solving climate change, because we show that technocracy is the solution to many more of our problems vis-a-vis animals, vis-a-vis the climate, vis-a-vis the environment. This is just completely conceded. B solves their climate change argument in the only material way it does, because their claim is about like 7% of emissions coming from cows or something, but if factory farming always exists, they always create the same number of emissions. Our claim is about creating the kinds of technologies that A, replace factory farming in general, like they say artificial meat will, or B, solve climate change even if we still have animal production, which means we solve their climate change argument and we solve the rights violation they purport to be happening, because we transition eventually from lobotomized animals to artificial meat as the cost bases of them fluctuate. If that's possible, which means we have the longest term solution and the solution to most of the arguments. Third ballot is that we're just not committing a rights violation and pain is bad, believe it or not. First argument here is just that it's GMOs. The responses to GMOs are a linguistics argument about the motion, which is probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. The motion refers to animals who do experience pain now. They have experienced pain before the advent of the technology. It doesn't apply to the individual animal itself and presuppose that the animal must have like a 3-minute window where it like can feel pain. And then we like get them with the needle and it's like, ooh, we fixed it. Like this is just so far from how referential terms work. And then the second response is like, it's expensive, but I already beat that shit, which means for the 9 structural reasons conceded out of the PS, and the vegans hate it. This is totally an assertion. Very small percentage of them are crunchy and they've conceded that by fiat they support it. So if it's a GMO and we've proven that structurally it has to be, and we've proven that by fiat they advocate for the system we're purporting, then it's GMOs and they're fucking fine with it. And it has to be GMOs because that's where almost all of the money is going in the status quo. So it's the likeliest place it'll come from. And it's the only way it can apply to all animals rather than individual specific animals. If it's GMOs, there's no rights violation at all. Their only response is fetuses have rights. Crazy fucking take, Daniel. But if that's true, plants do too. They have none of the characteristics, sentience, or the ability to feel pain by any definition anyone is given in the round. There's no reason to afford them rights. This means we prevent suffering and no rights violation occurs, and suffering is bad because everything on Earth instinctually pushes away from it. Their ballots are climate change. If they don't solve factory farming, they don't solve it. Also, no reason humans matter more. If their argument for why would like mean babies have no rights, maybe climate change is good because all the humans die and there's no more animals. And then the other thing is eat more meat.
Point of order. The antinatalism is new.
I'm not adjudicating that anyways.
Yeah, okay, valid.
Here.
All right, I'll take 5 to 10 minutes.
That was fun. Thanks all.
Yeah, good round.